Protection with UNICEF in South Africa. My journey on social protection started in Malawi in 2005, and I've worked with many of you ever since. So it's a wonderful reunion of friends, and we are very honored to be together. So this evening, we have 6 panel members who are going to debrief you on their sessions from 6 different regions. And then I'm asking them to highlight lessons learned and examples what are of relevance to other regions to appreciate and to further learn from. So I'm going to introduce to you the panel of this evening. And I'm starting with Dominic Richardson, the Senior Education Specialist from UNICEF Innocenti, who is on my right and who led the session on high-income countries this afternoon, and he has been working for OECD for 8 years on child and family policies with Olli, the person from Finland. And he has been one of the co-authors of the conference report for this conference. So then on my left, we have Mr. Jean Dupraz. He's our regional social policy advisor for East and Southern Africa. And he did lead the panel on Sub-Saharan Africa this afternoon. I'm very honored to have him here. Then on my right, there is Mr. Ruslan Yemtsov, the global lead from the World Bank, and he had the pleasure to lead this session on the Middle East and North Africa. Then on my left, we have Ms. Alexandra Barrantes, the Senior Social Policy Specialist for Development Pathways, who just led the session on Latin America and the Caribbean. And despite much progress that has been made in Latin America over the last 20 years, from many countries we learned from Latin American examples, we still see challenges of high inequality and migration. Then Andrea Rossi, our regional advisor for East Asia and Pacific from UNICEF. He covered Asia this afternoon. Andrea has been working as the head of social policy research with UNICEF in Mozambique and has been the former director of the Harvard Measurement and Human Rights Program and the research coordinator at the UNICEF Innocenti Research Center, and he worked for ILO as well. So I welcome you to read the bios of all the panelists, members, so you can have a more insight, appreciation of the high expertise that is here with you this afternoon. Last but not least is Yukie Mokuo, the UNICEF representative from Kyrgyzstan. And the way she liked to be introduced to you this afternoon was that she is the rep in UNICEF for Kyrgyzstan and who has accompanied the saga of the universal child grant versus targeted social benefits in Kyrgyzstan for the last 4 years. So we look forward to learning from the panelists, and since it is late, and we are all tired, it's time to start. As Margaret Gross said this morning, our friend from the World Bank, we all aspire that every child has the right to social protection and access to services and can grow, develop and thrive to their full potential. All these regions will present to you in this panel certain progress and good practices, but we come from different places to get there. So let's learn the challenges and opportunities. With that introduction, I'm asking Dominic Richardson to start with the debriefing on the lessons from the high-income countries this afternoon. Thank you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's my pleasure to do this. We had 4 excellent presentations in the high-income country session, looking at Canada, the United States, the OECD overall, and some work in Slovenia and Belgium. I hope I do them justice. Just for clarity, it's Olli Thevenon that I worked with from the OECD, as opposed to Olli from Finland. But, okay. just to be, so there's no confusion there. Okay. So some of the key points from the discussion, from the work that we produced as part of the preparation for this conference, a number of the UCGs that we identified globally came from high-income countries, and there's certainly a case based upon the high-income countries to answer for the efficiency and effectiveness of UCGs. Of every UCG we identified in high-income countries, about 2, they all have below-average poverty rates. It's clear that there's something going on there, and those 2 that don't have below-average poverty rates are around the the average. Those countries also are countries that provide lone parent benefits too, and extensive parental leave policies. One of the biggest challenges of producing or looking at UCGs and the effectiveness of benefits in high-income countries is the way we measure poverty in high-income countries is relative. And therefore, when we think about a UCG lifting a floor, we can expect that not to have the type of distributional effect in comparison to a benefit which has a progressive payment schedule. Also, the debates around what family benefits are for in high-income countries goes beyond poverty. The more mature systems in terms of how long they've been running are more sensitive to behavioural effects, concerns about fertility, employment incentives, and ultimately what families spend their money on. There's no question about whether these countries can afford to put in place UCGs. It can be done. Really, it's a political economy question which constrains the ambition in these areas. What we see, of course, as well is there's no commonality necessarily in how these benefits are managed. Each one is contextualized to the needs of the country, and it's something that perhaps is one of the points where high-income countries could communicate something to countries in middle and low-income settings that are looking to build these types of benefits, that there's no one silver bullet, there's no one size fits all, and every benefit needs to be adapted to the context in which it works. Linking the political economy and this adaptation, we had a good example from the OECD colleague about the recent changes in France, which moved from a UCG benefit which had very flat rate payments to a universal coverage benefit with a tapered progressive element. So if you earned over X number of thousands, your child benefit was cut in half, and if you earned over X number of thousands beyond, it was cut to 25% of the overall benefit. But if you earned 10 million euros, you still got some of that benefit. What's perhaps missing in the discussions was the discussion around systems preventing poverty. When we talk about targeting and means testing, it's to treatment of poverty and wide income distributions. I think one of the general messages is that small adaptations to existing welfare systems may be beneficial for reducing poverty rates, but it's not necessarily going to be the seismic change that we need to eradicate child poverty. And again, it's limited by the political economy question. Are governments willing to make those changes given the concerns about behavioural effects? And our last word on costs, a general word on costs, sometimes they can be counterintuitive. A number of family allowances in high-income countries introduce counter-cyclical or automatic stabilizers that change as need goes up and down. It's related to the targeting. And that means that some of the very high cash spenders in the OECD, like the United Kingdom, don't have universal child grants, spending about 2.5% of GDP in cash alone, whereas a country like Denmark, or indeed France, we've just mentioned, or Sweden, indeed, will spend near 1.5% of GDP on their cash benefit systems. And that's worth bearing in mind, given all of the cost issues. So very quickly, what we heard from the various presenters, from Olivier Thévenon from the OECD, there's a focus on work incentives related to employment and the importance in high-income countries of attachment to the labour market. That is one way to sustainably lift people out of poverty. But also, Ollie showed us some interesting results of how existing reforms in both housing benefits and family allowances, without changes to labour market attachment, could actually improve the effectiveness of benefits in different countries. Again, that talks to context. Through the labour market attachment, reflection on childcare in high-income countries is important, and generally talks to age-related considerations when developing any type of family allowance, when parents' attachment to the labour market might be weakened due to reasons of care, or indeed illness, or other things. Work from Chris Weimer and Sophie Collier from the Centre of Social Policy, Columbia University, looked at what might happen if you moved from the existing child tax credit in the United States, to a benefit, a child benefit that was more quasi-universal and filled in a gap of those families with children that are not accessing the child tax credit because they're not in work. To receive a tax credit at present, you need to be employed, you need to be registered with the tax system, and of course what that does naturally is exclude all sorts of people who don't have attachment to the labour market. Through their simulations, these adaptations would have, with a particular focus on paying a bit more for younger children, we're talking about the age-related effects, would have meaningful impacts on poverty as measured using the basket of goods approach in the US. Deep poverty and extreme poverty is the point of eradication of extreme poverty with the most generous, in inverted commas, approach. The costs there may seem high, $37 billion. We're looking at something around that for the easiest approach, I think. But in real terms, in comparison to what's spent in other countries on welfare, with the US actually in high-income countries spends the least on its cash transfers, that type of money is not really big in macroeconomic terms. Valerie Korosec from the Office of the President of the Republic of Slovenia talked to us about analysis of how Belgium would react if there was reform to bring in a universal basic income, and how indeed it worked in Slovenia, again showing that the universal approach is beneficial for children, reducing child poverty and reducing inequality at a budget-neutral approach. So not spending more, but spending it in a different way. Valerie did have some cautions for us, though, in regards to whether or not we should be focusing on bringing in a universal basic income for all, as children will grow into adults and eventually fall off that safety net. Again, it was a very strong message from Valerie about the political economy here, showing that you could indeed do a lot better in reducing child poverty if you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. But really there isn't the appetite for spending very high rates of government GDP on reducing child poverty, and that's not disconnected to issues related to expectations about behavioural responses, relation to detachment from the labour market, or indeed increasing family size. Finally, we had an excellent presentation from Palash Sanyal from the University of Saskatchewan, I hope that's right, looking at particularly how Indigenous populations in Canada had a higher risk of poverty, and how those populations are not attached to the new reform of the Canadian child benefit in the way that might benefit them. Big challenge is that there are conditions in place and policies in place, but there is an implementation gap. People distrust the system and therefore not engaging with it. So all the best laid plans perhaps not coming to fruition. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dominic. What came out very forcefully in that session was the issue of political decisions based on not only the different simulations, but especially the prioritization of the investment that comes from a universal child grant. So I'm not going into questions now. I'm asking Jean to follow with a debrief on the session of Sub-Saharan Africa. Jean Dupraz.
Thank you very much, Mayke. Good afternoon, everyone. So, in our panel on Sub-Saharan Africa, we had 3 excellent panelists, and we had the pleasure and honor to have the Honorable Minister of Labour and Social Protection from Kenya, who started by showcasing how, over the years, gradually, Kenya is moving toward universalism in the various social protection and safety net schemes. Some programs that started 15 years ago as pilots, 3,000 beneficiaries, are now at scale benefiting 1.3 million Kenyan people. And that was really an excellent example of how political commitment and a decision can really go a long way in terms of reducing child poverty. The Honorable Minister as well showed and demonstrated that commitment by the fact that those programs started 15 years ago through donor money. Sure. Now they are all funded by the government. And we see a gradual move towards this. We had as well excellent example coming from Kenya about child feeding program, universal health coverage, universal education. Then we had two very almost technical presentations, two simulations. One on Madagascar, showing how the removal of fuel subsidy, while it doesn't have an impact on poverty reductions, could free some fiscal space that could be invested in a program. And we had another excellent presentation on Ghana from Martin Evans, where basically the key message was what really is determinant in Africa is the demographics. And he showed that by doing universal child grant, it's almost like moving toward universal basic income. Because while 50% of the population are children, you find children in over 90% of households. So Mayke has asked as well to share a few lessons. And if you look at the situation of sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost, the idea of universal child grant is almost a no-brainer because of three basic facts. One is a demographic explosion. Yeah. Currently on the continent, there are 1 billion people. There are going to be 4 billion people in just 80 years. Population of children has doubled over the past 30 years, is going to double over the next 30 years. That's the first fact. The second is that poverty is alarmingly high. Basically, if you look at non-monetary poverty, 6 out of 10 children in sub-Saharan Africa live in poverty. You have the most populated country like Ethiopia, Tanzania, where the government has just released data on poverty among children, showing 90% of poverty among children. So when you look at this, it's almost a no-brainer. But what's happening at an aggregate level in Africa is that child development and socioeconomic indicators are not keeping pace. So in fact, today, we have more children living in poverty in Africa than 35 years ago at the beginning of the MDG. We have more children suffering from stunting than 35 years ago. So, of course, then it begs a few questions. What do you prioritize? And one of the key points that come is that universalism, moving toward universal child grant, cannot be at the expenses of investment in core sector for children, education, health, and water. Another key lesson that is coming by and large in the region is that very often governments have privileged quantity over quality. So we have seen, for example, in Zambia, just over the past 3 years, the number of poor people benefiting from cash transfer going from 1 million to 3 million in just the space of 3 years. Mm-hmm. However, now the program is facing tremendous difficulty because there haven't been investment in key systems, monitoring, payment, and so on. A third lesson is that those programs, they are very fragile and at the risk of shocks. Again, Zambia. Zambia nowadays, more than 20% of the revenue that the government makes is going into debt repayment. Mm-hmm. More than 20%. As a result, this cash transfer program, called the Harmonized Social Cash Transfer Program in Zambia, beneficiaries haven't received payment for a year, simply because there is no cash. Yeah. And that has a tremendous negative impact. Because we know And that's what has really been learned in Africa, is that those programs have an impact only if beneficiaries receive predictable payment and regular payment. A fourth lesson, picking up on what was said yesterday, the earlier you invest in children and in child grants, the more potential it has. However, most of the safety net social cash transfer program in Africa have shown, and we have seen this even in the most sophisticated grants, such as in South Africa, that children 0 to 2 are the hardest to enroll. So in fact, you miss them. And it's simply reason of birth registration and so on. And those are really important considerations. And maybe to finish, when we talk about universal child grants, in a context like Africa, what's really important is we need to balance, and social policies, social protection program cannot be inspirational. They have to be practical. And this is the reason why moving towards universal child grant has to be gradual. We have excellent examples from South Africa, for example, where now it's almost universal, but the way the government did it over 20 years was to start with children 0 to 5. 5 years later, you move to children 0 to 7, 0 to 9, 0 to 12. So gradualism is absolutely fundamental in a context like Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. I think many important lessons and also urgency to really review what is at stake with the African continent to get children's access to services, including access to social grants, in a less fragile way, but more predictable long-term and at scale. The Kenya example is indeed a good example, as is South Africa, whereby now both governments have taken the responsibility to finance these programs at scale with enhanced access to services, so it's not a compromise at the cost of health and education. So, thank you, Jean. I would like to move to the next and ask Ruslan Yemtsov, our lead from the global lead from the World Bank, to lead us into Middle East and North Africa. So at the end of the session, we can compare and see how we can share experiences and advise different regions. Thank you, Ruslan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm not new to the region, so it was really very interesting to interact with the presenters from the region. We had three very interesting presentations, two of them based on country or focused on country experiences. One from Tunisia, presented by the Ministry of Social Affairs, one from Iraq, presented by our UNICEF colleague, and we had one regional presentation that looked at the overall development of child-focused policies, cash grants, cash transfers in the region overall, and their legal framework, and assessed whether they are based on human rights. And we had really interesting thread connecting all these different presentations, three different presentations. So one, we basically agreed that MENA region faces really serious challenges. Its main challenge is instability. It's change in social contract. It's affected by big population displacements. It's affected by civil wars. It's affected by many societal conflicts that basically oppose citizens and the governments. It faces serious trust issues. And it's also a very young region with a huge youth bulge, a lot of young people that seem to be disengaged in the current political and economic environment. But there are also very promising developments there. We focused on some of them, and we tried to make a direct connection that was made during the conference already several times. one of the legacies of the old social contract in MENA region is a reliance on subsidies, fuel subsidy and food subsidies. They are still representing a very important share of the government spending, and often when we talk about universal child grants, when we talk about cash transfers, we point them as a source of the fiscal space. And it's kind of a no-brainer if you think about moving from what is considered, and now there is a progress in the societies, understanding that these systems are unjust, unfair, inequitable, rich people benefit more from it, they have huge inefficiency compared to direct cash transfers. So moving from them towards universal programs seems to be a no-brainer, yet it remains an exceptional case. Iran has done something close to it, and it still maintains a system with a pretty large coverage, but other countries are not pursuing this avenue. We try to understand why it is happening, why this obviously win-win situation is not used by the policymakers. And we came up with the conclusion that it's an issue of governance and trust. The programs that exist in the region, and it was presented in the excellent analysis by our colleagues from the Inclusive Growth Center in Brazil, the programs have very large exclusion errors. A lot of poor are excluded from those programs. And the new programs as well do not have this guaranteed inclusiveness in terms of how they are implemented. Looking at the legal side, whether these programs are entitlement, we also found a disconnect between 2/3 of the programs having a legal framework, being embedded in law, but yet a lot of them do not provide channels for participation. A lot of them do not have predictable sources of financing, and therefore some of the law are passed, they are not implemented, and there remains a big discrepancy between what is enshrined in law and what is actually implemented on the ground. We believe that the region, and there's important innovations in the regions that try to address it, precisely in the way how realistically it can be addressed. And these are very gradual approaches. The case of Tunisia is particularly interesting. Tunisia has a well-developed social insurance system, and there is an entitlement for family allowances, child allowances within the insurance, within the present insurance contributory schemes. These schemes have gaps in coverage that are very important. People from the formal sector are only covered by those schemes. The schemes are not covering any children beyond 3 in the households. So the large households that tend to be poor have less support. And the existing non-contributory programs have a strong bias towards categorical targeting. In other words, they target people who predominantly are disabled, cannot work, and therefore do not have many children. As a result, even though most of the labor force is covered by the contributory systems, almost 60% of children are not covered by these allowances that are provided through the contributory systems. We discussed how Tunisia is approaching this challenge, and the approach is very clear. It's a very gradual expansion, trying to include those in informal sector not covered by the present arrangements, contributory and non-contributory, into the child welfare scheme, ensuring consistency and harmonized support across the various pillars, and being very gradual in terms of the level of support and in terms of the expansion. That also is what is really interesting in that approach, is that it's based on a very detailed fiscal analysis that tries to make the system affordable and fiscally sustainable. That means that what is what is promised, what is described in law is going to be implemented. And that's the only condition to build the trust between the citizens and the states in order to move to the new social contract that would enable rechanneling resources from ineffective subsidies into modern systems supporting the future of these countries. We also talked about challenges in Iraq, and we noticed that this is easier said than done. We often think there is a fiscal space on the subsidies, forgetting how unpredictable those things are. For example, for oil exporters, Iraq has experienced really serious trouble in terms of poverty and social cohesion when the prices of oil fell. On the other hand, a lot of countries that subsidize food import those products, and they face tremendous difficulties when we experienced a rise in the food prices not so long ago. So it's a very moving, it's a very unstable fiscal space, and again, the only solution of moving towards a modern social contract is ensuring gradual transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruslan. I think it was very, very clear. We have all seen the social unrest and civil strife in the north of Africa. I think one lesson that is very interesting from this session is the no-brainer of moving from fuel and food subsidies to more universal transfer schemes. And that is of relevance to other regions as well, which comes back to the whole issue of governance and trust, which we also heard and learned from in the high-income countries. So those are some of the buzzwords that will be coming out of this conference. And then the social contract that needs to be created based on the law and based on the governance and trust that Ruslan explained so very well. So I would love to ask Alexandra Barrantes from Development Pathways now to lead us into the session from Latin America and the Caribbean, which has been giving us many promising examples over the last 20 years in terms of social protection programming. Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it was an honor for me to chair the session on Latin America and the Caribbean with a great set of panelists that we shared experiences. And it was, I just want to clarify, there were no government officials in our session, so it was mostly from both academia, from research, and also from international organizations, the presentations that were shared in the session. We had both a regional perspective from Latin America and the Caribbean, and also the experience of both the already existing scheme, the Asignación Universal por Hijo, the universal cash transfer that Argentina has implemented for the past 10 years. And also we had a proposal, in the case of Brazil, a study on a proposal for a universal child grant package, I would say, which would, in not my words, mean that it's a Bolsa Familia for all that has both universal and also targeted elements in terms of the actual proposal itself. One of the things, I'm not going to be able to go into each one of the presentations or the specifics about the proposal in Brazil or the already existing program in Argentina. I think we've had quite a few sessions that have covered those. So I will try and give like a summary of some of the cross-cutting issues or the interlinkages between some of the presentations, and that would sort of frame the debate and the discussion for UCGs in the Latin American and the Caribbean region. So one of the things that came across is that in the case of Latin America, obviously, everybody has heard about the flagship programs, the CCTs, the conditional cash transfer programs. So the debate around a universal child grant is naturally embedded within that synergy between the existence of CCTs, the experience of CCTs, but also the overarching social protection systems, because Latin America and the Caribbean have middle-income countries that have advanced in terms of the consolidation of also traditional social insurance schemes. So within that context, the discussion around UCGs come across as an important sort of coordination between the different schemes in existence and what can be done to improve the already existing cash transfers. So obviously the CCTs were framed within a context of segmented and informal markets that obviously did not permit to extend coverage of all in Latin America. And although the CCTs have been in existence for the past 20 years, one of the underlying issues that came across in all the presentations is that children are still overrepresented among the poor, and that there are still large coverage gaps in all of the countries in terms of including children and youth in those programs. So that's something that came across in all of the presentations, and that is something that is underlying in the debate in the region around UCGs. The other context, or the other element that is crucial for the Latin American, the Caribbean region, is the issue around inequality. We always say that it's the most unequal region in the world, and that obviously permeates into the debate around UCGs. And it's particularly interesting to take that into consideration, because the discussion also needs to go beyond just poverty, and it has to do also with those that are vulnerable to poverty, but also including larger masses of people. And that was something that was also present in the discussions. Obviously, in terms of challenges, there are quite a few challenges that are that we find in the Latin American region that are both old challenges and also new ones. Old ones that we've been talked and that have been addressed several times already is obviously the fragmentation of the systems. We have consolidated social insurance schemes, but they don't address the coverage gaps that we have in the region. But we also have issues in terms of fragmentation or lack of coordination between different levels of government, between different sectors. The labor market interactions on linkages were also mentioned throughout the presentations. But also the needs to go beyond that, and also issues around age biases that some of the programs might have. And then we also went into some of the issues that have been discussed in terms of design features of programs, because those also have obviously implications in terms of the coverage gaps that were mentioned. Both in the case of the regional presentation and in the case of Brazil, we had some micro-simulations in the case of the regional in terms of what it would entail to extend coverage to children and adolescents for cash transfers, both from a universal and a targeted approach. And I can't go into details, but that was something that was presented. And in the case of Brazil, and I think it's important that we highlight this, what the Brazil proposal would look like is a reshuffling of already existing funding for different projects that are by nature, from what was presented by the evidence, quite regressive. The idea that we reassess and that we reshuffle the fiscal space and the existing of those funds to a program that would be like a universal child grant that also incorporates some of the other elements. So the exercise, the proposal for the UCG in Brazil included exactly that. It's not getting out money. So the issue, and I think this pertains to some of the discussions also in terms of the fiscal space, that there's also issues around a limited amount of fiscal space is also related to the political economy and how we decide to prioritize what. And I think it was a very interesting and creative approach in terms of how to make the fiscal point, and also in terms of going back to different ministries and making the case for a universal child grant. So I suggest if you want more details, you can go talk to some of the presenters. So if you want to get your ideas to have your own UCGs being implemented in other regions. One of the other aspects that was highlighted was, in the case of Argentina in particular, was the importance of institutional arrangements. In the case of Argentina in particular, the existing cash transfer, the Asignación Universal, is very much embedded into a similar, it's been implemented by the same institution that is the Social Security institution, but it's also embedded in terms of the transfer values being very much aligned with those. So there's this issue of integration and sort of coordination between the sectors that was also mentioned. And the other issue that I would like to highlight, I think that came across in the presentations, both in the case of Argentina and Brazil, is the issue around conditionalities. In the case of Argentina, the cash transfer has conditionalities, so there's been issues or there's been debates about what their implication is to move away from conditionalities. That was something that was put onto the table. And in the case of Brazil, in terms of the proposal for the UCG and the package, it also has a large component that would have no conditionalities for the rights-based elements of the proposal. And that leads me, I think, into the final point. And again, it's a very, very broad stroke in terms of the highlights for the Latin American session, and which came across all the presentations, which is the issue around rights. And I think that is something that has also been discussed in several of the sessions. And given that we're at the ILO and also UNICEF as organizers of this event, is something that we need to point out, which is that we need to move away from the debate or the dichotomy between beneficiaries and citizens towards towards approaches and paradigms that move towards including more people. And I think the context of Latin America, because of the high inequality, large fragmented labor sectors, also pertains to this context. And so what was addressed, or what was highlighted during the sessions too, was that this speaks to not only from a human rights or sort of a rights-based approach, but also in terms of the sustainability of these programs. And that was something that was pointed out. And then just to finalize, when we talk about the fiscal space and when we talked about the fiscal equations in terms of how to finance these schemes, one thing that was pointed out, that these need to be fiscally responsible, but also socially responsible. And I would like to end with that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. What came out very clearly of the Latin American Caribbean experience was the need for simplification and harmonization of programs through a single registry. And that is very interesting for many African countries. A lot of different pilots started, different targeting mechanisms, and then over time, this has to become scalable, sustainable, working towards a single registry is a good idea based on the right approach. And the commitment from the Latin American countries to move away from conditionalities came through to the fore as well, which was a very interesting development. So Alexandra, thank you for sharing. I would love to invite Andrea Rossi to share with us the experience from Asia. Andrea.
Thank you so much. It's difficult to be among the last ones, but I have to keep you here. No, definitely, we have a fantastic section, I have to say, with examples from Indonesia to presentations from Thailand and from Nepal. And it was very clear since the first presentation from Indonesia how it is important when we look at social protection to move from a static analysis where we actually mainly take picture to a more dynamic one where actually we have to tell movies, not because in Asia we have Bollywood, but because that was the point. And the most important thing is the fact that understanding the social protection is not like a vaccine that you give the kids and then they are safe for the rest of their life. On the contrary, between 1 year and the other, children go in and out of poverty. And then even among the beneficiaries, you have kids that are going out of poverty and then come back to poverty. And there is a dynamics within different quantiles of the population through different processes that sometimes we underestimate. So that component is critical one. When a family enters in the process doesn't mean it will be out of poverty forever. Sometimes we underestimate it, we don't look at that kind of dynamics. So that was a fantastic presentation from Indonesia. And also the fact that sometimes we have this kind of simplification of the poor and non-poor, and without understanding that the complexity is much more diverse. Now, the work we are doing on child poverty, so moving from the just analysis of monetary poverty and going to multidimensional, help us to look at those things, but is not enough. We had very good examples, for example, of the analysis of indigenous kids and how that is different. So despite the fact they are facing deprivation, but what is faced by indigenous compared with urban population, etc., is quite diverse. So that was, I think, was a fantastic one. A second presentation, still for Indonesia, was a different one, looking at how you have to implement programs in a country that is highly diverse, that is geographically divided, and then you have to implement in situations where it's very difficult to reach. And so we had Indonesia, but also we have Nepal. So how the logistics of reaching the population, the last one, and it's not the last mile. We learned it was the last 3 days of walk, or the last 8 hours of walk that you have to do to make the cash reaching the children, force you to be innovative. And then I think that level of innovation in the process, the innovation in terms of designing the program was again another fantastic example for Indonesia. The third example, again into dynamics, I think is the case of Thailand. In terms of first this idea of the gradualism, like always you start pushing for something, you get a 0 to 2 child grant, and then you keep pushing the bar, and then you keep pushing the bar. And then you move from 3 to 6 to 7, and you go on. And then you increase the expenditure of the coverage, of geographical coverage, and then you expand the level of components. You increase the amount. And that is a very critical thing for South Asia, Asia and Pacific, actually. The fact that despite having it has the majority of kids of the world, but it also is a region that has the biggest and best economic growth, and still, when we look at the statistic of fiscal space and investment, is still representing the lowest level of investment in social protection in many countries. Sometimes it's just 1%, 2% of the GDP. So there is a space, there's a political space that to work. And if I had to follow the point that Jean was mentioning before, Asia is different things. Asia is an aging society where kids are getting less and less. That means on one side you have a more fiscal space, probably, but also you have a less political pressure. Kids are less relevant. You have a more and more aging people that are pushing for pensions and their own support. So that is another area that we have to think about, that the competition is different, the narrative has to change, and I think is critical. Another important things from the Thailand, two other points. One was the importance of, as we heard a lot, of the impact evaluation, but not just done in isolation by academics or a consultant for UNICEF. It was more about the impact assessment done together with the government as part of the process of the government to redesign, continually redesign and assess their own program, and that was critical. Within that one, the capacity of the government to look at the importance of exclusion error. Now, Thailand takes exclusion error very seriously, and they have an exclusion error of 30%, that if you do things, well, 30% is very, very low, and still is perceived as a critical one. And that in discussion that happened later on was so critical, the understanding that exclusion error is not just a random effect. The problem of exclusion error is that sometimes it's systematic. With a 30% or even 20%, you may have population that's systematically excluded, and that is the critical things. Then the importance of moving into universal as a way to reduce the exclusion error, but also acknowledging that it will not cancel completely exclusion error. Even when you go universal, you will have error. You will have kids that were supposed to reach and are not reached. And of course, the distinction between what is exclusion, so the exclusion by design, and error. People should be there, but not there. And the importance of information, the importance of access to the system. And finally, we had a presentation from Nepal. Again, the importance of the design, the importance of putting together a long-term vision of what are you planning in a country that has different kind of situation, both logistically and politically. I think that the discussion was super rich. It showed you how Asia and Pacific is a place where sometimes can be tough, the discussion, but when a decision is taken, things happen. And that is, I would say, an amazing experience. We can feel that in the room. The importance of keeping the pressure, keeping the partnership with government, with academia and different players is critical one. But also the capacity to look beyond the average, and I think that is the critical one. The average in Asia and Pacific doesn't tell you a lot. You have to disaggregate within each countries. First, because you have huge countries, so tell me what the average of China or the average of India doesn't tell you anything. There's more inside there. But also because you have to re-understanding the differences in terms of problems and challenges you may have within the same country. The importance of a relationship between the national government and the local government. The importance of culture and the political momentum, the political space, instead of the fiscal space, as we mentioned yesterday. And the importance to build that kind of momentum at the moment in Asia Pacific. We had a very good discussion about, so how much we have to invest. How much is enough? It's 2%, 3%, 4%. And of course, there is never an answer. The answer is what is possible today is an amount, and then tomorrow will be more. And finally, we had a very interesting discussion about the conditionalities and probably the importance of shifting from the concept of conditionalities to opportunities, or what we call the soft conditionalities. In Asia and Pacific is moving towards the cash and plus, where actually the plus is not the conditionality component, it's an opportunity one, so people are not kicked out, but still you have the opportunity to decide what is better for the families.
Wonderful, Andrea. Thank you so much. for a very concise recap on the Asia session. I hear three major things. One is, despite consistent economic growth, the allocation of GDP towards social protection is still woefully low. So there is this political space to walk to enhance commitments towards social protection contributions. Secondly, contrary to the situation in sub-Saharan Africa and Africa, that Asia is an aging population. So that is a complete different ballgame with looking at social pensions and so on, but also the example from Nepal to look at human capital development as an investment over time and starting with putting the child at the center of development. So many positive innovations to learn from Asia. And then last but not least, I wish to ask Yukie Mokuo, our representative in Kyrgyzstan, to share with us the lessons from the final session on Europe and Central Asia. Yukie.
Thank you very much. I know this is the very end of the long day, but I can tell you the biggest gem is in the region of Europe and Central Asia. Because I have a big heart in that particular region. So we had 4 countries, governmental delegates, Ukraine, Belarus, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Session was chaired by Minister of Social Development of Kyrgyz Republic. And we had also the researchers who came to present that very rich analysis. I would like to thank those who really brought a very good presentation to this rich session. First, I'd like to start that those 4 countries really share common history and certain challenges. As you know, that those are the countries which came out of the former Soviet system, which used to enjoy that very strong social security system. But all countries have gone through the very severe economic downturn after the independence in the 90s, which pushed those countries to go for the social targeting in terms of social assistance to the population, particularly to children. But now we are in the 21st century. Those countries also gained that economic growth. They are now classified as middle-income countries. But then the question is, in that middle-income country context, still, in spite of the fact that very good progress on the absolute poverty reduction, still those countries see that a certain level of relative poverty, and particularly it's all evident in any countries that the poverty rates goes higher, especially among young children. Solutions we have seen in the old countries is so-called hybrid approach. It's a mixture of, for instance, a universal birth grant, but also still targeting poverty-targeted approach to low-income families. Unique cases we have seen is, for instance, in Ukraine, Belarus, that approach is not only the cash benefit, it's also combined with that in-kind or service provision, such as nursery services, in the purpose of supporting the family welfare. So it's children, but not only the cash for children, but how to support that family. Obviously, that the challenges in those countries is the fiscal space and the financial constraints and affordability. The analysis which I have seen from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, it does show that even in that challenging situation, there is a fiscal space, and the simulation shows that if there is a GDP growth and the increase of tax revenue, the Uzbekistan case has clearly shown that the percentage that now the spending is about 0.68% of GDP. If you choose those approach to be converted towards universal grant, still it's going to be about 1.5% of GDP, which should be affordable is a scenario. But I need to address that we did not have enough time to discuss most important question. I think it's a political economy. The simulation shows that technically universal grant is more effective in poverty reduction, because in those countries where poverty targeting is chosen as a methodology, the exclusion error is still very high. So if you really want to reach those who are really poor, who are really in need, universal approach is the most effective way of poverty reduction. I think the evidence is very clear. But what has not been really well discussed, and what is most challenging, is that in this policy choice of the national process, how the policymakers can make a decision that all the taxpayers' money will go to children, while children don't vote and the pensioners vote. Kyrgyzstan's analysis has shown that the fiscal space, yes, because there is a non-contributory element of the pension system, which is eating a lot of money in the state budget. So if the policy makers are convinced that the choice of this national process is to prioritize children, the policy makers still need to convince that the public opinion, by strategic communication with clear evidence. But I was a bit sorry that we did not have enough time to go into that discussion in depth. But I just would like to highlight that I think these are the challenges in these middle-income countries, that if you do the analysis, there may be a possibility of affordability. There is a clear evidence that what works and what not. But then how you bring that the commitment of the policymakers and to be supported by public opinion. So I would like to end that this very rich discussion of this conference would give a very good inspiration to those policymakers, that when we go back to our own countries, that the policy choice and evidence are very clearly connected, so that we have a very strong public opinion to be supported. I would end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yukie. We are 10 minutes over time as the final session of today. But I think that what Yukie said were good final words of this session, unless there are urgent questions or remarks to be made to the panel. But I think what came across the 6 speakers and the representation on behalf of all the regional sessions was the issue of political economy and the issue of being able to present policy choices to a variety of policymakers, create trust, governance, and legal system, and come with the evidence as the impact, and the evidence is already very clear, but how do we package it in such a way that policymakers can take the right decisions, as we do speak on behalf of the children. So we have much more work to do to as social protection practitioners to package our argumentation better towards universalism of child grants, but in an holistic social protection system. So what we are seeing is it's not only the cash that's going to be making the difference, but also the whole overall social protection system, the birth registration, enhanced access to health education, the quality of social services within an overall social protection system. So I do look around for urgent hands, questions, clarifications to the panel members. Otherwise, I would like to then say there is someone who has lost a red iPhone, and please, if you have found it, bring it to Ian Orton this evening. Secondly, tomorrow we are starting at 9, and we don't come to plenary, we straight go into parallel sessions. And with that, commitment to a political economy, children first, universalism, and continued sharing across the regions amongst ourselves and in support of governments who have started to move forward with the child grants agenda. Thank you very much for the wonderful panel members.
wonderful chair.
Wonderful.
See you tomorrow.
It was an exciting session. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, Jean, I will be late because I have a lot of fundraising to do.